Now, you may have come across this before. You know you are going to have a bad day when you turn on the news and they are showing emergency routes out of the city. When your horn goes off accidentally and remains stuck as you follow a group of Hell's Angels on the freeway. When you get to work and see a 60 Minutes news team waiting in your office. When your twin sister forgets your birthday. When your income tax check bounces. When you wake up to the soothing sound of running water and remember that you just bought a waterbed. When the bird singing outside your window is a vulture. When you put both contact lenses into the same eye. When you realize that the phone number on the public bathroom wall is yours. And people have come up with a long list of those. When people have a bad day or a bad month or year or whatever, it often raises some question marks. And so today, I want us to look at a guy who had, I would say, the ultimate bad day. And so if you would, let's be turning to the Old Testament book of Job. We generally don't mind the small setbacks, the minor ailments, and the bumps and bruises. But how are we going to react when going through a real crisis? See, I've heard it said that Job is a book that nobody wants to read because it opens up to us all the possibility of extreme suffering. Okay, let me just give you a little bit of introductory material about this book. We're not given any indication of the authorship or the time of writing, and scholars, they argue about that. Many people believe that Job lived during the patriarchal age, before the law of Moses. And while the book is definitely written in poetic form, this poetic style, there's no reason to doubt that the events actually happened. You see, Job is referred to as a real person in the books of Ezekiel in the Old Testament and James in the New Testament. You see, God was speaking to Ezekiel and said, "If a country sins against me by committing unfaithfulness, and I stretch out my hand against it, destroy its supply of bread, send famine against it, and cut off from it both man and beast, even though these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in its midst, by their own righteousness, they could only deliver themselves." And so God put Job up there with Noah and Daniel when giving a sample of righteous men. And in James chapter 5, you'll remember from our study of James, it says, "We count those blessed who endured. You have heard of the endurance of Job and have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings, that the Lord is full of compassion and is merciful." Now, instead of a rags to riches story, we like those. We often make movies about them. This is a riches to rags story. And it's not about the suffering of an ungodly person. No one seems to have a problem with that. But it's the suffering of a very godly person. All right, with that in mind, let's begin with Job's background in verses 1 through 5. Now, I've asked Ken to read for us this morning and to read from the NIV, because it makes it a little bit easier to understand here. The scholars, they admit that this book can sometimes be a little bit difficult to translate.
In the land of Uz there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. And he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. His sons used to take turns holding feasts in their homes, and they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a period of feasting had run its course, Job would send and have them purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, "Perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This was Job's regular custom.
The land of Uz is often thought to be somewhere in northern Arabia, but that's not really important. What's more important is what it says about his character. He was blameless or beyond reproach. Now, that doesn't mean he was perfect. The only person who fit that was Jesus. It just means that there were no sins sticking out or hanging over his head. When he'd mess up, he would admit it and he would quit doing it. He was upright, or it can be translated as straight, meaning that he had honesty and integrity. He wasn't crooked in any way. He feared God. You see, he believed in God. He worshiped God. He respected God. And he wanted to please God. And as Solomon said, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom in Proverbs 9:10. Now, Job even said something to that effect in chapter 28. And that's quite contrary to what our culture is telling us these days. And he turned away from evil. He didn't flirt with it. He didn't see how close he could get to it without crossing the line. No, he shunned it, as the NIV says. Sadly, it is not very often that you find someone like that. But, like Job, we can live the same way. Well, looking at his possessions, that's obviously being rounded off as those numbers would constantly be changing. But the point is, he was the Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk of his day when it came to wealth. And he had all these people working for him. Well, we can see from verse 4, he had a good family that got along with each other. And it's been pointed out that it's quite a blessing to have children who enjoy being together. And besides his good example to them, he also offered sacrifices for them. And the head of the family doing this, it's one of the things that points to it being in the patriarchal age before the law of Moses. But the point is that Job was very careful to try to make sure that his family was right in the sight of God. Are we that concerned about our families? Okay, next, let's go to the permission to test Job in verses 6 through 12. Now, in this section, we are privy to some information that Job didn't know, and his wife didn't know, and his friends didn't know.
One day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." "Does Job fear God for nothing?" Satan replied. "Have you not put a hedge around him, his household, and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then. Everything he has is in your hands, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." And then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord.
And so there was some kind of heavenly council, and that's literally sons of God, a term used in different ways, but here it seems to be referring to the angels, as the NIV translates it. And the Hebrew here is actually the Satan. And Satan means adversary. Now, of course, we learn from the New Testament that he is the leader of the fallen angels. He is the one who tempted Eve in the Garden of Eden. And he's also referred to as the devil in other places, which means accuser. Now, God knew, of course, where Satan had been, but he always asked questions like that. Roaming throughout the earth. We may think of 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8. "Be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." Well, one thing we can see from verse 8 is that God pays attention. I think we all need to ask, could God brag on me like that? Well, Satan, he painted this picture of when people would put a hedge of thorns around something like a vineyard. to try to keep the wild animals and the thieves out. And his argument that Job, he was only righteous because it pays. See, he's only doing it for the blessings. Job, no, he's really self-centered and not God-centered. And then there's the most important thing that I think we can get from this section, and that's Satan has to get God's permission, at least on certain things. He's not allowed to just do whatever he wants. And at this point, Satan was not allowed to do anything to Job himself, just to the things that were connected to him. And so the calamities in verses 13 through 19.
One day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabaeans attacked and carried them off. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The fire of God from the sky and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and carried them off. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." And while he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, "Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you."
And so Job was hit with 4 calamities, 2 from marauders and 2 from natural disasters. And each of the first 3 would have been a huge financial loss. But before Job could even process what he was hearing, well, in came another servant. We're looking at verse 16. That's probably how they referred to lightning, the fire of God. And so some lightning struck, and it started this great fire that killed them. And I suspect verse 19 is referring to a tornado, which of course we're familiar with, being in Missouri. Now notice how it struck the 4 corners of the house. Now as a side note, man, our lives can sure be over quickly. And so we always need to make sure that we're ready. Now, some of you know the heartache of losing a son or daughter. Now, can you imagine losing all of your children at once? All right, let's take a look now at Job's response in verses 20 through 22.
At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship and said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." And in all of this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing.
Well, those, of course, were cultural signs of grief and mourning back then. Job went from being the richest man in the East to penniless and facing 10 funerals. It would be difficult to deal with any one of those things that happened, but think of all of them happening in one day. So there he was, thinking that life is good, family is good, God is good, and then everything just gets turned upside down. Well, that was a very mature response from Job. Do you think it would be yours? Some people point to Horatio Spafford, the guy who lost his 4 children at sea. And in response to that, he wrote the hymn, "It is Well with My Soul," which we sing from time to time. You might want to look up his story. Well, like Job, I think it's helpful to remember that it's God. It's God who's blessed us with these things in the first place. We need to be people of gratitude, people who count their blessings. And we need to keep in mind that we really don't own these things. We're just stewards who have them placed into our hands for a short amount of time. And notice that it says he worshiped in verse 20. It's been said that suffering will either break our back or bend our knee. And in this case, it bent Job's knee. Well, Satan, he wasn't satisfied. And so we find the second permission to test in verses 1 through 6 of chapter 2.
On another day, the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself before him. And the Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason." "Skin for skin," Satan replied. "A man will give all he has for his own life. But stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life."
Some people think skin for skin was an idiom kind of like quid pro quo, this for that. In other words, Job, he would have been willing to give up the skin of his animals, his servants, and even his children in order to save his own skin. Satan apparently believed that every man has his price. He believed that we'll all compromise our integrity if we're just promised enough or if we are put through enough. But it doesn't have to be true. And so God said he could do anything short of death. And so we come to Job's affliction in verses 7 through 10.
So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." He replied, "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" And in all of this, Job did not sin in what he said.
Can you imagine itching or hurting so bad that you would scrape yourself with broken pottery to try to get some kind of relief? Well, besides his skin, we can see from chapter 3 that he had no appetite or maybe even difficulty eating. He also mentioned difficulty sleeping and nightmares in chapter 7, halitosis and weight loss in chapter 19, gnawing pains and fever in chapter 30, and there are some others. Yeah, and I complain when I get a cold. Well, Job's wife entered the picture, and maybe he was thinking that he could at least get some comfort from her. Now, I don't know if she meant curse God and commit suicide or try to cuss God out so bad that he kills you, but that's what Satan expected of Job, to curse God. And some people think that's why Satan didn't kill his wife. He wanted to use her in this way. And it's sad when Satan will try to use those closest to us. And it's been pointed out that even today, Satan, he will try to use all of these same things against us in one way or another. Like our income, our family, our health, our spouse, and our friends, as we'll see. Now, looking at his response in verse 10, I think it's implied that she was not a foolish woman. I suspect she was just overcome with grief. I mean, look, those were her children as well. That was her property as well. And now she's trying to take care of her husband and seeing him like this. So look, I'm not letting her off the hook, but it makes sense. And so Job gave another very mature response. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? And it wasn't God directly, but he still allowed it to happen. And of course, Job, didn't have any idea about that stuff that was happening in the spirit realm. Well, finally, we come to Job's friends in verses 11 through 13.
When Job's three friends, Eliphaz, the Temanite, Bildad, the Shuhite, and Zophar, the Naamanite, heard all about the troubles they had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud. And they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him, because they saw how great his suffering was.
Have you ever had someone go through something so drastic that it caused you to hardly recognize them? So remember, Job had shaved his head, chapter 1, verse 20. He was covered with sores, chapter 2, verse 7, and he had lost a bunch of weight, chapter 16 and verse 8. Well, the dust on their heads is just another sign of grief. And the point may be that it was worse than they had expected. Well, Romans chapter 12 and verse 15, it says, "Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep." And some people say, like Job's friends, well, we should let the afflicted speak first. But that's the best thing they did. It says they came to comfort him, but as we continue reading, they really did everything but that. Have you ever gone through a difficult time in your life, and the words of your friends, which were intended to help, they didn't help at all? We need to be careful not to be comforters who fail to comfort. See, sometimes they just need our presence. They don't need our great words of wisdom. Now, looking at this book, his friends, well, they apparently believed. They believed in something referred to as the law of divine retribution, that you always reap what you sow in this life. And so they thought he just must have done something to deserve it. Because, well, every bad thing happens, it's retribution for sin. In essence, Job, he must have really messed up and done something evil. We didn't know you had it in you, Job. We didn't know you were so bad. But as we've seen from these 2 chapters, that's not always the case. We can also find passages like John chapter 9. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind?" Jesus answered, "It was neither that this man sinned nor his parents, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him." Well, Job, he obviously disagreed with his friends. He disagreed about what he had done. And after his 3 friends argued with him for a while, a younger friend, Elihu, came along, and he had a little bit different idea, better, but still wasn't completely right, and he came off as being pretty arrogant. And yes, Job got pretty low. And he said some things that he shouldn't have said. And he had a number of questions for God. But in the end of the book, God came, and he said, "Job, I want to ask you some questions." And you may remember he asked Job all these questions about the creation that, of course, Job had no idea, no answer to. Well, Job got the lesson. He put 2 and 2 together about the knowledge and the greatness and the majesty of God. One thing we learn from God's confrontation and his questions is that we are not to try to bring God down to our level. Well, on top of that, God said that Job's friends had not spoken what was right concerning him. I wonder how many times God could say that about you and me. Here's the point. The Lord had reasons for allowing Job's suffering, but he never told Job those reasons. Job wanted to know why all these things were happening to him, but God demanded that he not question the decisions of his Maker. Well, after God corrected him, Job ended up saying, "Behold, I am insignificant. What can I reply to you? I lay my hand on my mouth, and I repent in dust and ashes." It's not always for us to know. As he said in chapter 42, in verse 3, "I have declared that which I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know." I had a teacher at Sunset who was beginning a class on the book of Job. And he asked his students, what is the theme of Job? And one student raised his hand, and he said, "The theme is, why do the righteous suffer?" The teacher said, "No." Now, the answer to that question, by the way, why do the righteous suffer, is it's none of your business. But the theme of Job is the righteousness of God. I'm sorry, but we are not going to get all of our questions answered to our full satisfaction while here on earth. I may not understand, but as it's been said, it's not important that I understand. It's important that He understands and that I trust Him. I heard about a little girl who was amazingly calm through some really nasty turbulence. And someone noticed it, and he couldn't help it, and so he asked her, "How come you're so calm?" And she replied, "My daddy is the pilot." I think we need to get to the point where we can say the same when we are going through the turbulence of life. Now, look, I'm preaching to myself here. As we can see from this book, God is the one who is ultimately in charge. Regardless of what happens to us, God is still on the throne. And as it says in Romans 8:28, we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. The question we must all answer: is God worthy of our worship and obedience in all circumstances of life, the good and the bad? When tragedy occurs, some people are driven toward God, and others are driven away from God. Some people become bitter, and others become better. Yes, Job was upset, and he wanted to know why those things were happening to him, but through it all, he never turned his back on God. He never gave up. He questioned God, but he certainly never cursed Him. Job passed the test. He continued in his faith in spite of his amazingly difficult circumstances, way more than any of us, I believe, have had to endure. And so the Lord blessed him greatly, as we can see from the last chapter. Now, that's why the James passage says what it does. Satan was wrong. He was wrong about Job, and he can be wrong about you and me.